So here's a really tricky subject in the arts and humanities, and just life in general, and it's nationality and citizenship. Now, we always identify ourselves, maybe if we're traveling abroad, we identify ourselves as Canadian, or as American, or Japanese, whatever. But how do we actually build these national identities? But what actually goes into building a national identity? In Canada, is it just hockey and maple syrup? Well, of course not. But often we, and even academics, use terms like nationality and citizenship without really always thinking about what goes into that, or more importantly, what doesn't go into it. So who's excluded? So to give you an example of what I mean, I'm going to show you a map. And let's say this here is Louis Riel. He's hanging out in Manitoba in the Red River colony. And we have the land surveyors from Ottawa who are trying to form Canada, and they're coming over here and encroaching on Métis land. Now, this turned into the Red River Rebellion, which there's a video about here, and that's a whole other different story. But the issue was that the Métis had a claim on the land and had established a colony, had established a government and a separate culture, a distinct identity. And the Canadians came in and said, well, now you're going to be part of us. This obviously caused a lot of friction. So in Canada, we always use the example of Quebec and their claim to a separate and distinct nationality and culture as reason for wanting to leave Canada. Now, the problem is that not everybody in Quebec feels this way, as several referendums have shown, and it causes a lot of internal division and division amongst other Canadians. So when we think about nationality, we really have to think about who's doing the deciding about who's a national and who's not. In the Quebec case, we had the state of Canada saying, well, no, you can't leave, or if you are going to, you need to hold a referendum and vote on this. And within Quebec, various people who identified as French Canadian, who saw themselves as Quebecois but also wanted to stay in Canada. There were people who saw themselves as just distinctly Quebec and wanting to separate. And then there was a whole issue of people who maybe didn't identify with either. There was a lot of First Nations people who felt like they weren't consulted at all, saying, well, hang on a minute, we're part of Canada, we've got our own separate national identity as well as First Nations, and now we're being asked to leave Canada. This isn't fair, we need to be consulted. Now, a lot of issues of nationality also go hand in hand with the issue of self-determination, and there's several groups that identify as a separate nation and are actually recognized by their states and say, okay, well, that's fine, you're part of us, but you're separate. So examples are the Kurds, the Tamils, and the Scots. Nations that are part of a country or part of a kingdom or empire or whatever, but also claim a distinct national identity that sometimes is recognized and sometimes isn't. So, if you're trying to form a country, obviously nationality and citizenship are really big issues. How do you take a whole bunch of disparate groups and turn them into a country? Now, I mentioned the issue of ethnicity before, and this is really important to think about, because we might like to say, well, we're Canadian, and anybody who lives in Canada is a Canadian citizen, and that's just their national identity. But it's a little bit trickier than that, because Canada is based on immigration. Besides First Nations people, we're all new here, and we might go back 7 generations, but there was still a point where we were maybe Austrian, or German, or Russian, or Japanese, or Chinese, or we were from Malawi. I mean, there's so many different things that go into making up a national identity. So, is everybody exactly the same? Think about how ethnicity plays a role in your nation and how that's part of a nationality. There are people of different races and different ethnicities and different cultures in almost every country, but are they full citizens? Do they have all the same rights? Are they fully recognized as citizens? This is an important thing to remember. The flowers actually have nothing to do with this point, but I'm going to give you another example, and this is of African slave communities in Mexico. Now, these communities formed and stayed a part of Mexico, but often they're referred to as sort of the hidden minority or the forgotten minority in Mexico, because being black is not what traditionally goes into part of being Mexican. So I have to stress here that these are ideas that are formed by governments and political bodies and states, and not necessarily by the people, although people obviously decide to some degree what nationality they are. Just because you identify as a certain nationality or as a certain type of citizen, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're granted full rights. So if we think about women in a lot of countries, especially in the 19th and early 20th century, and even now in some countries, being a woman, you might be considered a citizen. Often countries like to use the example of the household or the mother as sort of being really important to citizenship. But if a woman can't vote or doesn't have the same full protective rights as a man, then are they a full citizen? So, to complicate things even further, think about what different kinds of roles we're expected to play within our own nations and our countries. What types of expectations are put on you if you're a male or a female? Or is your group that you identify with even considered as part of a citizen or as part of the country? Often countries decide and will have constitutions that actually decide who is a citizen and who's not. So if you're trying to form a country, how do you make citizens out of just people? Well, people do it through art, they do it through novels and songs, they do it through literature. They also use constitutions, things that actually outline what it means to be a citizen and what all of your rights are. They can use ethnicity. Only certain ethnic groups are considered to be part of that country, and everybody else is just kind of living in it. Nationality and citizenship are extremely complicated issues, especially when we live in a world where people move back and forth a lot. There's always the issue of migrant workers. What country do they belong to? Whose responsibility are they? It's a loaded topic, but I'm going to leave you on the note of starting to consider this and think about your own nationality. If you're Canadian or American or Brazilian, whatever, what goes into that nationality? And how do you consider your place in your country?